Imagine waking up one morning and your country has just been effectively erased from the global economy.
Yeah, without a single shot being fired.
Right. You haven't been invaded, no bombs have dropped, but suddenly your ships are just being turned away from foreign ports.
Customs systems literally refuse to acknowledge your existence.
Exactly. I mean, your supply chains freeze, contracts vanish, and your local businesses start bleeding cash within hours.
It is terrifying.
It really is. You are in a high-stakes duel, but instead of a weapon, your opponent pulls out a weaponized tariff schedule. So welcome to this deep dive into international relations strategy.
We are getting straight to work today.
We are directly converting complex source material into high-retention frameworks for you. We're unpacking the EU's evolving economic posture, specifically their new trade bazooka, and this widening US-EU rift over NATO.
And our approach here is strictly analytical, right? We are going to trace the exact cause and effect chains between geopolitics, the economy, security, and the domestic impact.
Completely. So let's start with this so-called trade bazooka. I mean, the name alone tells you how much the tone in Europe has changed.
Yeah, it definitely does.
But just to clarify for everyone listening, trade bazooka is not the actual law sitting in Brussels. Right?
Oh, no, it's far from it. Trade bazooka is just, a journalistic shorthand. The formal administrative term you need to know is the Anti-Coercion Instrument, or ACI.
The ACI, got it.
Right. And it's basically a highly concentrated set of unilateral trade enforcement tools. The EU built this specifically to counter economic coercion from other state actors.
Which is a massive shift from their usual free trade posture.
Yeah.
But to understand why they built it, we really need to look at the trigger event.
Yes, the 2021 dispute.
Right, between China and Lithuania. So context for you listening. Lithuania is this small Baltic nation, an EU member, and they made a sovereign diplomatic decision to let Taiwan open a representative office in Vilnius.
And it wasn't even a full embassy, just a representative office. But Beijing viewed this as a really severe violation of its One China policy.
And China's retaliation was swift. But, like we said earlier, not military, purely economic. They basically deleted Lithuania from their customs registry.
Just wiped them out of the computer systems. Lithuanian goods were completely blocked at the border.
But it gets crazier, because the coercion didn't stop there. China went to major multinational corporations, like German automakers.
Right, companies that use Lithuanian parts.
Exactly. And China essentially said, hey, if you want to keep selling cars in China, you have to strip every single Lithuanian component out of your supply chain.
That secondary boycott is the crucial detail here. I mean, China wasn't just punishing Lithuania, they were weaponizing the interconnectedness of the European single market.
Forcing Germany and France to punish a fellow EU member on Beijing's behalf.
Exactly.
So Brussels looks at this and they have this horrifying realization. A foreign power is strangling an EU member, and they have zero rapid response tools to fight back.
None at all.
But wait, what about the World Trade Organization? I mean, isn't that the whole point of the WTO? You break the rules, you go to trade court.
Well, that is the exact institutional crisis this exposed. Historically, sure, you file a WTO dispute, but the WTO's dispute settlement process is notoriously painfully slow.
Like, it takes years.
Years. By the time they hand down a ruling, Lithuania's economy would be irreparably damaged.
Not to mention the WTO's appellate body like their Supreme Court has been totally crippled. The U.S. spent years blocking new judges.
Right, so the institution is functionally paralyzed, which is the root cause of this EU policy shift. They realized relying on a paralyzed WTO is just strategic suicide.
The era of purely rules-based trade is over.
Completely over. We are firmly in an era of geopolitically driven economic policy. The EU's primary objective now is achieving true strategic autonomy.
They need a credible deterrent. So let's break down the mechanics of this anti-coercion instrument. If someone tries to pull a Lithuania again, what is actually in the EU's toolkit?
It's a severe administrative arsenal. If they determine a member is being coerced, Brussels can impose rapid unilateral countermeasures. We're talking aggressive tariffs.
Right.
Quantitative import restrictions like capping the actual volume of goods allowed in.
But it's not just boxes on ships, is it?
No, it goes way beyond that. They can go after services and foreign direct investment. They can legally lock foreign companies out of massive European public procurement contracts.
Oh, wow. So like a huge infrastructure project in France. The offending country's firms are just instantly disqualified.
Instantly. They can also restrict intellectual property rights. Patents or trademarks might temporarily lose protection. They can even impose targeted financial sanctions.
I mean, I hear this and I just think of nuclear deterrence theory. You build the weapon hoping you never actually have to use it.
That is precisely the strategic motivation. You build this massive economic weapon, put it on the table, and hope the threat alone makes major powers think twice.
I get the logic, but I have to push back here. Isn't this incredibly dangerous?
How so?
Well, if the EU, who usually champions international law, starts bypassing the WTO with unilateral sanctions, doesn't that legitimize everyone else doing it? I mean, if everyone builds a bazooka, global trade governance just shatters.
I wouldn't disagree with that at all. Many economists share your exact concern. But for Brussels, the rules-based order was already shattering. They're just adjusting.
But it definitely accelerates the fragmentation.
Oh, absolutely. It introduces massive unpredictability.
So let's talk about the impact of that unpredictability on an emerging power like India, because this feels like a huge double-edged sword for New Delhi.
It really is. So let's look at the opportunity side first. Europe wants strategic autonomy, which means diversifying supply chains away from China.
Right, they need new partners.
Exactly. And that is an enormous opportunity for India. Indian manufacturing, tech, pharmaceuticals, they can step in and fill those gaps.
Okay, but the other edge of the sword.
The risk. India's markets are deeply integrated with Europe. If a trade dispute pops up, say, over labor standards or climate regulations, India is suddenly exposed to these rapid, unilateral EU countermeasures.
The EU doesn't have to wait for the WTO anymore. They just pull the trigger.
Right, on tariffs or investment restrictions almost immediately.
Okay, let's lock this in for you listening. Time for an active recall question. What was the specific trigger event that accelerated the EU's anti-coercion instrument?
Just think back a few minutes.
Right. The answer is China's targeted trade pressure on Lithuania.
Spot on. So let's generate your 150-word exam answer framework for this section. Get ready to take notes.
Keywords you want to underline: anti-coercion instrument, strategic autonomy, WTO bypass, and geopolitical trade effect.
Right. For your intro, you define the ACI as both a journalistic shorthand, the trade bazooka, and a formal unilateral instrument.
Then the body.
Right.
Detail the trigger, which is Lithuania, and list the policy allowances, like tariffs and IP bans.
And for your conclusion, note the fragmentation of global trade and that dual impact on India's geo-economics. Opportunity versus risk.
Perfect. So moving on, we cannot fully grasp Europe's push for economic autonomy without looking at their fracturing security consensus. We need to pivot to the widening rift between the US and the EU over NATO.
Because here is where geoeconomics and geopolitics physically collide. We have to establish the NATO baseline first. It's governed by the Washington Treaty.
And the bedrock is Article 5, right?
Yeah.
Collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly. But the legal mandate of that treaty is strictly geographical. It covers the Euro-Atlantic area. It does not say an attack anywhere in the world.
Now, obviously, NATO has done out-of-area operations before, like Afghanistan or counter-piracy.
Right, but those have always been legally ambiguous and politically sensitive.
Which brings us to the trigger event for the current fracture.
Yeah.
The ongoing conflict and instability in West Asia or the Middle East. And we're seeing two very different stakeholder positions here. Let's look at the U.S. first.
So Washington expects allied solidarity globally. They view West Asia instability as a direct threat to NATO's core.
Because of terrorism, energy flows, migration.
Yes, and they view the region through a great power rivalry lens. They're looking at strategic competition with state actors, like Iran.
And there's this underlying frustration about burden sharing, right? The U.S. feels it pays for global security while Europe falls short.
Yes. The famous 2% benchmark. The commitment that every NATO member spends at least 2% of their GDP on defense. For Washington, that is the ultimate litmus test of an ally's commitment.
Okay, so that's the U.S. view. Contrast that with Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. They look at West Asia and draw a totally different conclusion.
Very different. Their primary argument is legalistic. West Asia simply does not trigger Article 5.
But the root cause is really domestic, isn't it?
Exactly. War fatigue. European societies are deeply traumatized by the blowback from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya.
Because Europe actually borders the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The U.S. doesn't. When West Asia escalates, Europe gets the refugee crises.
They get the immediate domestic political backlash. So European states overwhelmingly prioritize regional stability, diplomacy, and de-escalation over military intervention.
But NATO operates on consensus. So what does this mean operationally?
It means NATO is avoiding direct combat in West Asia to preserve alliance cohesion. They're sticking to an indirect role, intelligence sharing, logistics, strengthening Euro-Atlantic defense.
Okay, I have to push back on the EU stance here. If the U.S. is right, that disrupted energy flows and migration directly impact European soil, isn't strictly defending just the Euro-Atlantic, completely outdated.
That is the strategic dilemma. On one hand, overextension, following the U.S. risks dragging Europe into endless conflicts that shatter their domestic support.
But on the other hand,
You risk global irrelevance. If you don't secure your own vital supply chains in the 21st century, what's the point of the alliance?
and this strains transatlantic unity, which is literally the bedrock of post-WWII security.
And rival powers, Russia and China, they are watching this closely. They exploit these Western divisions.
Which forces the U.S. to rely on ad hoc coalitions instead of unified NATO operations.
Which are fragile and degrade the predictability of global security.
Okay, let's pause for another active recall question for you. What specific benchmark is at the center of the U.S. burden-sharing frustration?
That would be the 2% GDP defense spending target.
Got it. So let's build your 250-word exam answer structure for this rift.
Keywords to underline here. Article 5, Washington Treaty, burden sharing, 2% GDP, war fatigue, ad hoc coalitions, and strategic autonomy.
Intro. Contrast NATO's regional origins with these 21st century global expectations.
Body paragraph 1 is the U.S. view. Focus on NATO as a global security actor, strategic competition, and the 2% GDP frustration.
Body paragraph 2 is the EU view. Strict Article 5 interpretation, fear of escalation and refugees, and domestic war fatigue.
And your conclusion. Note the necessity of redefining NATO's scope to prevent rivals like China and Russia from exploiting this exact rift.
Amazing. All right, let's synthesize these two massive threads. The economic side, the trade bazooka, and the security side. The NATO rift. How do they actually connect?
They are two sides of the same coin. The European reluctance to follow the U.S. into military conflicts is deeply tied to why they built the Anti-Coercion Instrument.
It's all about this grand shift toward independent geo-economic security.
Exactly. The root causes are rising geopolitical competition and severe supply chain vulnerabilities.
Right, they can't rely entirely on the U.S. security umbrella anymore because the U.S. is pivoting to the Indo-Pacific.
And they can't rely on Chinese supply chains either because China will weaponize them. So the EU is building a massive administrative toolkit.
We talked about the ACI, but let's rapid fire the rest of the toolkit. There's the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
Which sounds environmental, but it's a massive geo-economic lever. It functions as a geopolitical toll booth.
Right. If China or India wants to sell carbon-intensive steel in Europe, they have to pay a massive tariff, basically forcing them to adopt EU climate regulations.
Exactly. And the toolkit also includes stricter export controls on critical tech, anti-subsidy investigations like against Chinese EVs, and this whole overarching policy of de-risking.
De-risking from China, not decoupling, but securing independent access to rare earths and tech.
The strategic logic here is a total transition from market-driven integration to pure geo-economic governance. Trade policy is now aligned with security.
So what does this mean for India's balancing strategy?
It forces complex dilemmas. The global order is fragmenting, the WTO is weakening.
And India relies heavily on maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, working with the U.S. and the Quad.
Right. But India also maintains vital ties through non-Western platforms like BRICS.
So as transatlantic cohesion strains, India really has to double down on self-reliance. Atmanirbhar Bharat isn't just a manufacturing slogan. It's a geopolitical imperative to secure supply chains and maintain strategic autonomy.
Precisely. If the global order fragments, you have to be able to stand alone.
Let's do a final rapid revision recap. Chronological linkages. Ready?
Let's do it.
It starts with Lithuania trade pressure. That leads to the creation of the EU trade bazooka, bypassing a weakened WTO.
Concurrently, West Asia conflict triggers the US-EU-NATO rift over Article 5 and the 2% GDP target.
Which fuels the European push for full strategic and economic autonomy, resulting in tools like CBAM and de-risking policies.
Geopolitics dictates the economy, shifts security, hits domestic realities.
Incredible. So, as we wrap up, what's a final provocative thought for everyone listening to mull over?
Well, think about this. If the EU actually succeeds in establishing total strategic and geo-economic autonomy operating entirely independent of U.S. military leadership and Chinese supply chains, how does that fundamentally rewrite the definition of the West in a multipolar world order? Does a unified West even exist anymore, or are we just looking at competing fortresses?
Oh, wow. That completely changes how you look at the news. A tariff adjustment on microchips isn't accounting. It's a weapon being loaded.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Be sure to review your answer frameworks, integrate those keywords into your active recall systems, and we will see you next time.